The rain was coming down hard when my son-in-law threw my suitcase onto the soaked driveway. "That's all your stuff," he said, shoving $500 into my hand. "Get out. You don't belong here anymore." My daughter stood beside him, staring down at the floor. "Dad, this is better for everyone." Then the front door slammed shut and locked behind them. I thought losing my family was the worst thing that could ever happen to me until the next morning when a call from a lawyer changed my entire life. I am 71 years old. My name is Milton Aldridge. For 33 years, I worked as a heavy-duty tool and die maker in Rockford, Illinois. I spent my life working with steel, measuring things down to the thousandth of an inch, making sure parts fit together exactly. But standing on the wet driveway at 9:47 on a cold October night, I realized I had failed to apply those same tolerances to my own life. The suitcase hit the concrete with a heavy thud. The cord snapped on impact, and my life spilled out. Folded flannel shirts, my old steel-toed work boots smelling of machine oil, and the framed photograph of Martha, my wife of 43 years, taken on our anniversary in 2018. I stood in the pouring rain, watching the water creep under the glass, slowly blurring her smile. Dennis Harmon, my son-in-law, stood in the doorway. He was 38, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who talked loud at barbecues. He ran 3 failing franchise restaurants in town. Under the yellow porch light, his face looked hard and unfamiliar. "That's everything," Dennis said. "We checked the room. Don't come back, Milton." I looked past his shoulder into the warm hallway. My daughter, Brenda, was standing about 10 feet back. She had her arms wrapped tight around herself, her eyes fixed on the wall. She wouldn't look at me directly. She hadn't looked at me in weeks. "Brenda," I said, my voice rough from the cold. "Brenda, honey, just let me come inside tonight. It's pouring. I'll find a place in the morning. I promise." Her mouth tightened. She took a step backward, fading into the shadow of the hallway. "Dad, it's better this way," she said. Her voice was flat, like she had spent the afternoon practicing those 5 words. "Dennis and I need space. Toby is already asleep." Toby was my 9-year-old grandson, the only one in that house who still talked to me like a human being. Dennis reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of folded bills. He held them out, not looking at me. "Here," Dennis said. "There is $500 here. That will cover a motel for a couple of weeks. You can get yourself sorted out." I had never taken a handout. I paid off a 30-year mortgage in 2019, but my wife was gone, my house was sold, and my daughter was choosing her husband over my survival. I took the money. "You're going to remember tonight, Dennis," I said as I folded the bills into my shirt pocket. He pulled the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. The porch light died a second later. I crouched down in the driveway, my 71-year-old knees screaming in the damp cold. I gathered my wet shirts and stuffed them back into the split suitcase. I picked up the photo of Martha wiping the mud off the glass with my sleeve. "I'm sorry, Martha," I whispered. I dragged the suitcase to the curb and opened a rideshare app. A silver Camry pulled up shortly. "You know any motels nearby?" I asked. "Somewhere clean but cheap?" The driver looked at my soaked flannel shirt. "Mrs. Gable's place on Clement Street," he said. "She rents rooms by the week, clean. Quiet. Decent folks." "Take me there," I said. I didn't look back at the house as we pulled away. I knew Brenda was probably standing at the window, watching my taillights before drawing the curtains shut. I had lived in that house for 14 months, and in that moment, I realized I had been homeless the entire time. Mrs. Gable was 72, with silver hair pinned back, and the kind of sharp, non-nonsense eyes that had seen everything Rockford had to offer. She took one look at me standing on her porch at 10:15 p.m., soaking wet, and didn't ask a single question. "Room 7 at the end of the hall," she said, handing me a key. "The radiator works, and there's hot water. Breakfast is at 7. Get inside." Room 7 was small, with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a noisy radiator. I sat on the bed and counted the damp money on the dresser. $500 bills. The price of my eviction. I lay back on the thin pillow and stared at a water stain on the ceiling. I let my mind drift back to the mistake that had brought me here. 14 months ago, after Martha passed, our house on Dunmore Avenue felt like a tomb. Brenda suggested I sell the house and move in with them. She said she wanted to keep an eye on me. My old friend Clifford Vance had warned me. He had called me twice that summer, telling me to come stay at his place. But I was stubborn. I wanted to be close to my daughter. So I sold the house, gave Brenda and Dennis $150,000 to help with their mortgage, and moved into their guest room. At first, it was fine. But by winter, the guest room was needed for Dennis's mother. I was moved to the office. By spring, the office was needed for a home gym, and I was moved to a storage room off the back of the garage. It was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single window facing a wood fence and a bare bulb on a pull cord. I was mowing the lawn, fixing their plumbing, and watching Toby. Dennis called me the live-in helper to his friends. Brenda never defended me. I closed my eyes, listening to the radiator knock. Then my phone vibrated on the wooden dresser, an unknown number with a local area code. I answered it. "Milton Aldridge?" The voice was formal, measured. "Yes," I said. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I am an attorney here in Rockford. I represent the estate of Clifford Vance. I am calling to inform you that Clifford passed away on October 3rd. I have been trying to locate you for several days. My chest went tight. Clifford, my friend of 40 years. He named you the sole beneficiary of his estate," the lawyer continued. "We need to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. at my office on West Jefferson Street. Please bring identification." I sat up in the dark room, the phone pressed to my ear. Listening to the silence of the night, I did not sleep much that night. I lay in room 7 and stared at the water stain on the ceiling, turning Richard Caldwell's words over in my mind. The way he had said Clifford's name was measured, like a man carrying a heavy load across a slippery floor. I had spent 40 years knowing Clifford Vance. We had met in 1982 in the break room of a tool and die shop, both of us 27 years old, arguing about the proper clearance for a stamping die. We had eaten our lunches out of metal lunchboxes, our hands stained with grease that never quite washed out. That was the start of a friendship that lasted through marriages, layoffs, and the slow creep of age. By 6:00 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely. I showered in the shared bathroom down the hall, put on my least wrinkled flannel shirt, and went downstairs to Mrs. Gable's kitchen. She was already there, setting out a pot of black coffee and a plate of warm biscuits. "You look like a man who has somewhere to be," Mrs. Gable said, setting a heavy mug in front of me. "I have a meeting at 10, I said, "an attorney on West Jefferson Street." She nodded once, a non-nonsense gesture of respect. "Drink your coffee. Eat a biscuit. The world doesn't stop because you're tired." I sat at her table and drank 2 cups of coffee. It was a comfortable silence, the kind I hadn't experienced in 14 months at my daughter's house, where every silence felt like a trap waiting to spring. At 9:45 a.m., I walked into the offices of Caldwell and Associates. The receptionist, a polite young woman, led me back to a corner office with large windows overlooking a courtyard of bare oaks. Richard Caldwell stood up to greet me. He was about 50, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. "Mr. Aldridge, thank you for coming," Caldwell said, motioning to a leather chair. "Please sit down." I sat. He returned to his desk and folded his hands. "I'll be direct with you," Caldwell said. "Clifford Vance passed away on October 3rd. It was a sudden cardiac event. The paramedics said it was fast, and he didn't suffer." Even though I had known since the night before, hearing the words spoken aloud made the room feel very cold. Clifford was gone. The man who used to call me every Saturday morning just to complain about the price of diesel and ask if my knees were still acting up. The man who had been my anchor after Martha passed. "I didn't know," I said. My voice sounded thin. "Brenda and Dennis, they didn't let me get the mail, and my phone—" I stopped. I didn't want to explain my family problems to a stranger. Caldwell nodded slowly, his expression neutral but observant. "We had trouble locating you. Your address on Dunmore Avenue was no longer valid, and the phone number we had went to voicemail. I've been moving around," I said. Caldwell opened a thick manila folder. "Clifford named you the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. To say he did well for himself after leaving the machine shops would be an understatement." He pulled out a sheet of paper. His holdings include the Vance Self-Storage Group, which operates 9 major self-storage facilities across 3 counties. He also owned 8 light industrial warehouse parks leased to manufacturing firms and a managed investment portfolio at First Midwest Bank. The total assessed value of the estate is approximately $24.8 million. The number hung in the air. I heard it, but it didn't mean anything to me. I had spent my life earning $28 an hour, budgeting for groceries, and making sure my mortgage payments were sent on the first of the month. $24.8 million was a number from a television show, not my life. Clifford built all of that? I asked. He did, Caldwell said. He was a very shrewd investor, Mr. Aldridge. But he never forgot where he started, and he never forgot you. Caldwell reached under his desk and lifted a heavy wooden box, about the size of a boot box. It was made of dark, polished walnut with brass hinges. On the lid, my name, Milton, was written in Clifford's loose, blocky print. Clifford left instructions that this box be delivered to you directly, Caldwell said, placing it on the desk between us. He was very specific that you should open it privately when you are ready. I reached out and touched the smooth wood. The grain was deep and rich. Just seeing his handwriting made my throat tighten. Why didn't he tell me he was sick? I asked. He didn't want you coming to see him out of obligation, Caldwell said softly. You know how Clifford was. He was a proud man. He wanted your friendship to remain what it had always been, unconditional. I pulled my hand back, resting my palms on my knees. I missed his last 2 calls. I was busy. You were staying with your daughter, Caldwell noted. Though it wasn't a question. He closed the folder. There is one more thing. Clifford left a dog, a golden retriever named Buddy. He's 13 years old. Clifford's will specifies that you are to take ownership of Buddy immediately, and that I should bring him to you today. Buddy, I whispered. I remembered when Clifford got him as a puppy. Clifford had been lonely after his own business took off, and I had told him that a man needed something at home that was always glad to see him. I have him at my house, Caldwell said. I can bring him to Mrs. Gable's boarding house this evening if that is acceptable. Yes, I said. That would be fine. I stood up and picked up the wooden box. It was heavier than I expected. We will begin the probate proceedings on Monday, Caldwell said, standing to shake my hand. Because of the size of the estate, it will take 6 to 9 months under Illinois law to finalize the transfers. But the businesses will continue to run under the current management, and I will handle the legal administration. You don't need to worry about the day-to-day operations for now. Thank you, Richard, I said. I carried the walnut box out into the cold October afternoon. I walked back to Mrs. Gable's, holding the box against my chest. The wind was blowing dead leaves across the sidewalk, and the sky was a flat, heavy gray. I felt the weight of the box, the weight of the money, and the empty space where my best friend used to be. Back in room 7, I set the walnut box on the wooden dresser under the tilting lamp. The radiator knocked and hissed, a dry heat filling the small room. Outside the window, a gray birch tree shook its last leaves onto the brown lawn. I pulled the wooden chair up to the dresser and sat down. My hands were shaking slightly, not from the cold but from the sudden heavy silence of the room. I reached out and lifted the lid of the box. The first thing inside was a cream-colored envelope with my name, Milton, written in Clifford's familiar block print. Beneath it, I could see a bundle of papers and something wrapped in a soft blue cloth. I opened the envelope carefully. The letter was written on yellow legal pad paper, 3 pages long. Clifford's handwriting was slightly uneven, the way a man's writing gets when he is tired. Milton, the letter began. If you are opening this, it means I am gone, and they finally did what I always feared they would. I am sorry I wasn't there to help when it happened. I tried to be. I had to stop reading. I pressed my palms flat against the dresser and closed my eyes, breathing through my nose until the heat behind my eyelids subsided. I could almost hear Clifford's voice, gravelly and slow, speaking the words. I opened my eyes and kept reading. You turned down my offers 3 times. Last summer, last Christmas, and once more in March when I called and you didn't pick up. I am not telling you this to make you feel bad. I am telling you because I want you to understand that I saw it coming. I have known Brenda and that husband of hers long enough to see which way the wind was blowing. I wanted to be wrong, Milton. I very much wanted to be wrong. But you always did love that girl more than was probably good for you. My chest tightened. He was right. I had wanted so badly to believe that family meant something, that if I gave them everything, they would give me a corner of their lives in return. In the bottom of this box, Clifford's letter continued. You will find every letter you ever sent me. I kept them all. I know you thought I was terrible at writing back, and I was, but I read every single one, usually twice. There is also a photograph in here. The one Jack Miller took at the shop in 1982. You have grease on your cheek, and you are laughing at something I said. I kept it in my desk drawer for 40 years. I set the letter down and reached into the box. I lifted out a thick bundle of letters held together by a rubber band that had gone dry and brittle. They spanned 4 decades. Some were written on lined notebook paper, others on the backs of old machine shop invoices. Some were written on stationery Martha had bought for me. Clifford had saved every single piece of mail I had ever sent him. Beneath the letters was the photograph. A black and white print, 4 by 6 inches, slightly curled at the edges. 2 young men in work shirts standing in front of a massive metal lathe. Both of us were grinning. I recognized the shop, the smell of coolant and metal shavings almost coming off the paper. I barely recognized myself at 27 with dark hair and a sharp jaw, a smudge of black grease on my left cheek. I turned the photo over. On the back, Clifford had written, "The day we started." I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth. The grief came up sudden and hot, a physical weight in my throat. I sat there for a long time looking at the 2 young men who had no idea what the next 40 years would bring. Finally, I picked up the letter again to finish reading. There is one more thing in the box. In the bottom left corner, wrapped in the blue cloth. That is the watch I was wearing the day you pulled me out of that drainage ditch off Route 9 in 1987. You probably remember it better than I do. I only remember the freezing mud and your voice telling me to hold on. Open the back cover. I reached into the box and lifted the soft blue cloth. Inside was a steel-cased wristwatch with a black leather strap. The crystal was scratched, but when I held it to my ear, I could hear the faint, steady ticking of the gears. It was an old manual wind watch. I turned it over and used my thumbnail to pry open the small notch on the case back. Engraved on the inside of the cover, in tiny hand-carved letters, were the words, "Thank you for saving my life. Everything after was because of you." The memory came back in a rush, a late afternoon in February 1987. A sudden blizzard had turned the roads into sheets of ice. I was driving home from the shop, about 2 minutes behind Clifford. His truck had hit a patch of black ice, spun out, and slid into a deep drainage ditch at a sharp angle. The driver's side door was pinned against the frozen mud, and cold water was pouring in through the floorboards. Clifford was trapped. I didn't think. I grabbed a heavy tire iron from my trunk, slid down the icy bank, and smashed the passenger window. I hauled him out through the glass and dragged him up the bank, wrapping him in my heavy work coat until the ambulance arrived. I had never thought of it as saving his life. I just thought of it as doing what any friend would do. But Clifford had carried that moment with him for 38 years. I sat in room 7, holding the ticking watch in my palm, and let the tears come. They weren't the quiet, polite tears you shed at a funeral. It was the heavy, rib-shaking crying of a man who realized how much love he had ignored while chasing the approval of people who didn't care. I cried for Clifford, for the calls I didn't return, and for the 40 years of quiet loyalty that had been waiting for me while I slept in a drafty storage room. As the room grew dark, I heard a soft, low sound outside my door, a heavy sigh, followed by a gentle scratch against the bottom of the wood. I stood up and crossed the room, my boots creaking on the old floorboards. I opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a golden retriever. His muzzle was almost completely white, and his eyes had the cloudy, gentle look of a dog that had seen many winters. His tail was moving in a slow, steady arc, not the frantic wagging of a young pup, but a calm, certain greeting. He looked up at me, and there was no hesitation in his eyes. "Hey, boy," I said, my voice cracked and rough. "Hey, buddy." He walked forward and pressed his head against my leg. He didn't just sniff. He leaned his entire weight against me, the way dogs do when they have decided you belong to them. I reached down with a hand and buried my fingers in the thick, coarse fur behind his ears. He let out a long sigh and closed his eyes. I looked up, Richard Caldwell was standing at the end of the hall, a black leash in his hand. "I'm sorry to return so late, Mr. Aldridge," Caldwell said quietly. "But Clifford's instructions were very specific. He wanted Buddy brought to you the same day you opened the box," he said, and I am quoting his written notes. "The dog will know he is my friend. Don't let anyone else introduce them." "He knows," I said, looking down at the old retriever. "He knows exactly who I am." "Clifford got him as a puppy in 2013, Caldwell said, walking down the hall toward me. "He told me it was because of a conversation the two of you had on his back porch. You told him a man needs at least one living thing in his life that loves him without a contract or a checklist. He named him Buddy to remind himself of that." I remembered that afternoon. We had been drinking coffee on Clifford's porch, watching the rain, and he had been complaining about a tenant who had defaulted on a warehouse lease. I had laughed and told him he was getting too cynical, that he needed a dog to keep him human. He had called me 2 weeks later to say he'd bought a golden retriever. "Come in," I told Caldwell. We sat in the small room. I sat on the edge of the bed, and Caldwell took the wooden chair. Buddy immediately walked over and lay down across my feet, his chin resting on his front paws. His warm weight was the most solid thing I had felt in 24 hours. Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with 2 mugs of coffee and a plate of chocolate chip cookies. She didn't say a word. She just set the tray on the corner of the dresser, gave Buddy a soft pat on the head, and left, closing the door behind her. "Now," Caldwell said, opening his briefcase on his knees. "I know today has been a lot to take in, but Clifford wanted me to make sure you understood the structure of the estate before we begin the formal process on Monday." "Go ahead," I said, holding the warm mug. "The Vance Self-Storage Group consists of 9 properties," Caldwell explained, handing me a typed sheet. "They are all operating businesses. Clifford had a general manager named Philip Dawson, who has run the day-to-day operations for 11 years. Philip is a good man. The facilities are highly profitable, with a combined annual net revenue of approximately $1.4 million. Philip knows you're coming, and he is ready to work with you." "I know Philip," I said, looking at the paper. "Clifford introduced us at a barbecue a few years back. He's a straight shooter." "He is," Caldwell agreed. "The 8 industrial warehouse parks are also fully managed. 5 are currently under long-term leases with manufacturing companies, and the remaining 3 have minor vacancies that the leasing agents are working to fill. The investment portfolio at First Midwest is managed by a fiduciary advisor named Carol Birch. The current value is $16.2 million, mostly in municipal bonds and low-risk equities. Carol will want to meet with you in the next 30 days to review the accounts." I listened to the numbers, but my eyes kept drifting to Buddy. The dog was watching me, his tail giving a soft thump against the floor whenever I looked down. "Under Illinois law," Caldwell continued, "since the estate is valued well above the simplified transfer threshold, we must go through a supervised administration in the probate court. I will file the petition on Monday. It typically takes 6 to 9 months to validate the will and complete the formal transfer of assets to your name. During this time, the court protects all assets. Nothing can be sold, transferred, or modified without court approval. Your interests are fully secured." 6 to 9 months, I repeated. "Yes," Caldwell said, "but as the named executor and sole beneficiary, you will have access to the estate's operating accounts for your personal expenses and the maintenance of the properties. You don't have to stay in this boarding house, Milton. I can arrange for a draw from the estate accounts to secure a house or a condo immediately." I looked around room 7, the tilting lamp, the blue quilt, the radiator that knocked and hissed. It was small, but it was mine. "I'll stay here for now," I said. "Mrs. Gable is decent folks, and Buddy seems comfortable." Caldwell noted, writing something on his legal pad. "I need a contact number and a current address for the court filings. Room 7. Mrs. Gable's boarding house, Clement Street?" I said. He stood up, closed his briefcase, and buttoned his charcoal coat. He looked down at Buddy, who didn't move from my feet. "Clifford told me one last thing before he passed," Caldwell said at the door. "He said, 'Tell Milton the dog is never wrong about a man. If Buddy stays, Milton is doing just fine.'" After Caldwell left, I sat in the quiet room with the watch ticking on my wrist and the old golden retriever asleep across my feet. For the first time since my daughter had closed her curtains on me, I didn't feel alone. The next morning, I woke to my phone vibrating on the dresser. The screen lit up with Brenda's name. I stared at it as it buzzed against the wood. In a town like Rockford, news travels fast, especially when it involves a major estate and a prominent businessman like Clifford Vance. I didn't answer. The call ran its course and went to voicemail. I set the phone face down, dressed, and took Buddy out for a slow walk around the block. The air was crisp and smelled of autumn. The neighborhood around Clement Street was working class, with neat, modest homes, chain-link fences, and dry leaves scraping along the concrete. Buddy moved at a pace that suited both of our old joints, stopping to inspect every tree while I waited patiently. My phone buzzed in my pocket twice more during the walk, both times showing Brenda's name, followed by a text. "Dad, I heard about Clifford. Can we talk? I'm so sorry." I read the text standing under a bare maple tree. 2 nights ago, she had stood in the warmth of her hallway, refusing to look at me while her husband tossed my suitcase into the rain and handed me a $500 eviction fee. Now, she was sorry. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked Buddy back to the boarding house. At 11 a.m., I was sitting in Mrs. Gable's parlor reading the Sunday paper when the sound of a heavy V8 engine pulled up outside. I knew that sound. It was Dennis's 2019 Chevy Tahoe, a vehicle he leased and bragged about constantly, as if the size of the monthly payment were a badge of honor. I didn't get up. A moment later, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Gable came out of the kitchen, giving me a look that asked a question without a single word. I shook my head slightly. She went to the door anyway, because it was her house, and she wasn't the type of woman to let someone else's trouble keep her from answering her own door. I heard Brenda's voice in the entryway. It was pitched high and sweet, the social tone she used when she wanted to make a good impression on a stranger. "I'm so sorry to bother you, ma'am," Brenda was saying. "I'm Brenda Harmon, Milton's daughter. Is he available?" Mrs. Gable didn't answer immediately. I could picture her standing there, analyzing Brenda's expensive coat and her carefully styled hair. "I'll let him know you're here," Mrs. Gable said, her voice flat. She appeared in the parlor doorway and nodded toward the hall. I folded the newspaper, stood up, and walked out. Brenda was standing on the porch, holding a large casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil and a smaller plastic container. She had a tight, hopeful smile on her face, but her eyes were darting around the porch, taking in the chipped paint and the old wicker chairs. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "I heard about Clifford. I am so sorry. I know how much he meant to you." "Thank you, Brenda," I said. I made your favorite," she said, holding out the heavy dish. "Beef stew. Martha's recipe with the little red potatoes. I called Aunt Clara to get the exact measurements." I looked at the dish. My wife, Martha, had made that stew every Sunday during the winter. It was the smell of our home for 40 years. In the 14 months I had lived under Brenda's roof, she had never cooked it once. She had always told her mother she didn't have the patience for anything that took more than 30 minutes on a stove. "You made this?" I asked. "Of course," she said, her smile widening. "I called Aunt Clara for the recipe. I wanted to do something. Can I come in?" "We can sit on the porch," I said, gesturing to the wicker chairs. Her smile stiffened for a second, a quick recalculation passing behind her eyes, but she nodded and sat down, placing the casserole dish on the small table between us. She folded his hands in her lap, looking like a woman in a dentist's waiting room. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice soft and coaxing. "Are you okay? This place is nice. It seems really nice. Mrs. Gable seems wonderful. But Dad, you shouldn't be in a boarding house. You could stay with us. We want you to come home." "You and Dennis want me to come home?" I asked. "Yes," she said, leaning forward. "We talked about it. Dennis feels terrible about the way things ended. He really does. He's been worried about you. He was just stressed about the restaurants, and he let his temper get the better of him. He hasn't slept a wink, Dad. He's been so worried about you." As she spoke, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. "Dennis." I slides my thumb across the glass and put the phone to my ear. "Dennis," I said. "Milton." "Hey, man. Dennis's voice was loud, hearty, and entirely casual, the tone of a salesman trying to sound like a man without an agenda. Listen, I heard about your friend Clifford. That's tough. Good guy by the sound of it. He paused for a fraction of a second. So, how much did he actually leave, Milton? Is it as big as they're saying? There it was. Not, are you okay? Not, do you have a warm place to sleep? Just the number. The target he had been aiming for since he heard the news. I looked at Brenda. She was watching me, her hands still folded, her face a mask of careful concern. The lawyers are still sorting through the paperwork, Dennis, I said, keeping my voice even. It's complicated. Right. Right, of course, Dennis said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. Well, look, if you need any help navigating the commercial stuff, I'm happy to sit down with you. I know how these estate things can get complicated, especially for someone who hasn't dealt with that kind of paperwork before. Brenda and I just want to make sure you're taken care of, Milton. Your family. I appreciate that, I said. I'll be in touch. I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. That was Dennis, I told Brenda. He just wants to help, Dad, she said quickly, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. We both do. Please. Pack your things and let's go home. I looked at the casserole dish sitting between us on the wicker table. The foil was perfectly crimped around the edges, and the dish itself was brand new. It was a clear glass dish, still bearing the sticky residue of a price tag on the bottom. She hadn't even washed it thoroughly before throwing the stew inside. It was a performance. A prop purchased on a Sunday morning to show how much she cared, now that she had learned my net worth was no longer zero. I reached into my coat pocket. It was the same flannel-lined coat I had been wearing when Dennis pushed me off the porch. My hand closed around something hard and dry. I pulled it out and set it on the table right next to the foil-wrapped casserole. It was a stale bread roll. The crust was hard and yellow, and it had gone flat from being stuffed in my pocket for 2 days. I had bought it at the gas station on Clement Street on Friday night, right after the rideshare driver dropped me off. It was the only food I had bought before finding Mrs. Gables. Brenda stared at the roll, her eyes widening. What is that? She asked. This was my dinner the night you locked me out, I said, keeping my voice quiet and steady. A $1.50 bread roll and a bottle of tap water from Mrs. Gables' shared bathroom. I ate it alone in room 7, listening to the radiator hiss. It's funny. It tasted better than anything I've eaten in your house in 14 months. Brenda's face went through several rapid changes. First came surprise, then a flush of deep red that crawled up her neck, followed by a defensive tightening of her jaw. Dad, that's not fair, she said, her voice rising slightly. You know Friday night was a misunderstanding. Dennis was out of his mind with stress. The restaurants are struggling, and we were just overwhelmed. We didn't mean for you to spend the night in some rundown motel. This isn't a motel, I said. It's a boarding house. And it wasn't a misunderstanding, Brenda. I spent 14 months repairing your home, mowing your lawn, and looking after Toby. I did it because I believed that family was a contract written in the heart. But to you and Dennis, I was just a live-in handyman whose usefulness had run out. That's not true, she protested, her eyes filling with tears. I love you, Dad. We both do. You love the idea of $24.8 million, I said. She flinched as if I had struck her. The number was out now, flat and cold on the porch table. She looked at the bread roll, then at the new casserole dish, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. I'm keeping this roll, I continued, picking it up and putting it back in my coat pocket. I'm not sure why yet, but I think I'll know when the time comes. I stood up, picked up the warm glass casserole dish, and placed it back into Brenda's hands. Tell Dennis I'll be in touch about the estate, I said. That's what you came to find out. Now you know. Brenda stood holding the dish against her chest, her eyes suddenly bright with something that might have been tears and might have been anger. That's not fair, she said, her voice tightening. No, I agreed. It really isn't. I went back inside, letting the screen door click shut. Through the parlor window, I watched her carry the casserole dish back to the Tahoe. She sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, staring at the steering wheel. Before she finally started the engine and drove away, Buddy came and stood beside me at the window, his tail giving a single, slow wag. I know, boy, I told him. I'm keeping the bread roll. Monday morning came, and I spent the day with Richard Caldwell. We walked into the county probate court, filing the initial paperwork for Clifford's estate. The courthouse was a gray stone building, cold and drafts filling the corridors. I sat on a bench while Caldwell handled the clerks. Everyone seemed to know Clifford's name. When the clerks saw the estate documents, their attitude changed. They became polite, almost deferential, scurrying to get the files. I sat there in my scuffed boots and faded flannel, feeling like an interloper. After the courthouse, I drove to the main office of the Vance Self-Storage Group on the east side of town. It was a neat, modern office building attached to a massive row of blue metal storage units. Philip Dawson met me at the door. He was 61, a compact man with a gray mustache and grease under his fingernails from fixing a gate latch. He shook my hand warmly. "Clifford talked about you all the time, Milton," Phillips said, leading me into the office. "He always said you were the only man in this county who could rebuild a cylinder head without looking at a manual. We spent 2 hours going over the books. The businesses were in excellent shape. Clifford had run a clean operation, paying his bills on time and treating his staff well." Philip showed me the accounts. The money was real, but it still felt like numbers on a screen. The rest of the week went by in a blur of slow walks with Buddy and quiet dinners at Mrs. Gable's. She didn't ask about the money, though I knew she had seen Brenda's Tahoe and the lawyers coming and going. She just made sure my coffee mug was full every morning, and that Buddy had a bowl of fresh water on the porch. Brenda called Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday before 8 a.m., which told me Dennis had put her up to it on a schedule. I answered on Thursday. "Dad." Her voice was 3 notes higher than normal, the register she used when she needed something. "I just really want a chance to sit down together as a family. Toby has been asking about you." That last part was the only thing in the sentence I believed completely. "What time?" I said. 6 p.m., she answered immediately. "I'm making pot roast." I told her I would come. After I hung up, I looked at Buddy and said, "She's making pot roast." And Buddy thumped his tail once against the floor, which was the appropriate level of enthusiasm for the situation. The house smelled of slow-cooked pot roast and artificial apple air freshener when I walked through the front door. The dining room table was set with Brenda's Good Holiday Place mats, the embroidered ones with the gold trim, and 2 tall white candles were already lit. It was a Thursday night, a weeknight, when they would usually be eating takeout on paper plates in front of the television. The performance was in full swing, and it was working very hard to project a warmth that had never existed in that house. Dennis met me in the entryway. His smile was so wide I could see his back molars. He reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it a beat too long and placing his other hand on my shoulder. "Milton, Dad," he said, his voice booming in the narrow hall. "So glad you could make it. Come in, come in. Let me take your coat. We've got beer, cold water, or I've got that single-barrel bourbon you used to drink." "Water is fine, Dennis," I said, sliding my coat off. I made sure to reach into the pocket first, transferring the dry bread roll to my trousers pocket. Brenda came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me with a nervous, scanning gaze, trying to read my expression. "Hi, Dad," she said, stepping forward to give me a quick, tight hug. "The roast is just resting. We're almost ready." Toby appeared from the hallway. He was 9, wearing his school clothes, his hair slightly messy. When he saw me, his face broke into the first real, uncalculated smile I had seen in that house all evening. "Grandpa," he said, running over to wrap his arms around my waist. "Hey there, buddy," I said, patting his back. "How's school?" "It's good," he said, pulling back and looking up at me. "Did you bring Buddy? Mom said you got a golden retriever." "No, Toby," I said. "Buddy is resting at the boarding house. He's an old dog, and he doesn't like the cold nights much." Toby's face fell with disappointment. "Oh, can I come visit him?" "We'll see, Toby," I said. Dennis immediately stepped in, his hand on Toby's shoulder, guiding him toward the table. "All right, Toby, let's let Grandpa sit down. Go wash your hands." We sat at the table. The roast was tender, carrots and potatoes arranged neatly around the platter. Dennis poured himself a generous glass of bourbon, not offering any more to me after I had declined the first time. He drank quickly, his shoulders relaxing by a fraction as the alcohol took hold. "So," Dennis said, reaching for the basket of rolls Brenda had set out. "I was talking to a guy at my golf club yesterday. He does a lot of work in commercial real estate. He was saying that the self-storage market in Illinois is booming right now. The cap rates are excellent. If you ever need a second set of eyes on the Vance Group accounts, Milton, I'm happy to help. I've got a lot of experience managing lease structures and vendor contracts." "I appreciate that," I said. I took a slow sip of water. Brenda watched us, her fork moving her carrots around her plate. "Yes, Dad," she said. "Dennis is really good with business paperwork. It's just so much for one person to handle, especially at your age. We don't want you getting overwhelmed." "Richard Caldwell is handling the legal side," I said. "And Philip Dawson has been running the operations for 11 years. He seems to have a good handle on it." "Well, sure," Dennis said, his voice rising slightly, the bourbon starting to loosen his tongue. "But Dawson is an employee, Milton. At the end of the day, he's looking out for his salary. Family is different. Family looks out for the long-term wealth. You need someone you trust holding the reins, especially when the probate court starts asking for administrative decisions." I didn't answer. I ate a piece of potato. It was perfectly cooked, seasoned with rosemary, but it had no taste. After Brenda cleared the dinner plates and brought out a store-bought apple pie, Dennis leaned back in his chair, his bourbon glass refilled. He began listing all the things he would do to optimize the storage units, talking about automated gates, security cameras, and raising the monthly rents by 15% across the board. I reached into my pocket. My fingers closed around the dry, yellow crust of the bread roll. I pulled it out and set it flat on the white tablecloth, right between the melted white candles and the gold-trimmed placemats. The roll was flat, scuffed, and looked like a piece of garbage salvaged from the street. Dennis stopped talking mid-sentence. He stared at the roll, his mouth slightly open. Brenda's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her face drained of color, her eyes wide and fixed on the bread. Toby looked at it with the simple curiosity of a 9-year-old. "What's that, Grandpa?" Toby asked, leaning forward. "Is it a toy?" "No, Toby," I said, my voice quiet and calm in the sudden silence of the room. "That is a bread roll. I bought it at the gas station on Clement Street last Friday night, right after your dad threw my suitcase into the driveway. It cost 1.50 cents. I ate it with a bottle of water in room 7. That was my dinner." The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Dennis set his bourbon glass down. The click of the glass against the wood was loud. His jaw was set, a dark look crossing his eyes. Brenda looked down at her plate, her lip trembling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's not fair. Why would you bring that here?" "Because it belongs here," I said. "It's the only thing on this table tonight that represents the truth." I stood up, picked up the bread roll, and slipped it back into my coat pocket. "Thank you for the dinner, Brenda," I said. "The pot roast was very good." I walked out of the dining room. Neither Dennis nor Brenda stood up to follow me. They sat frozen at the table, their eyes fixed on their empty plates, as if the silence itself had become a physical presence in the room. I could hear the tense, low whispering starting between them the moment I stepped into the hallway, their voices sharp and angry. I pulled on my coat, opened the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was freezing, carrying the sharp scent of damp soil and wood smoke. I had just reached the end of the front walk when I heard the soft patter of feet behind me. I turned. Toby was standing on the concrete walk in his socks. He had run out of the house without putting on shoes or a coat. He was shivering, his arms crossed over his chest, his face pale under the streetlight. "Toby," I said, walking back and crouching down in front of him. My old knees popped and ached in the cold, but I ignored the pain. "You can't be out here in your socks, buddy. You'll catch a cold." "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice trembling. He looked around as if he were afraid his father was watching from the window. "I'm right here," I said, putting my hands on his shoulders. "What is it?" Toby swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears that didn't spill over. His chin was shaking. "I heard Dad talking to Mom in the kitchen," Toby said, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Before you came, he said He said if you don't sign the papers he made, you aren't really family anymore. He said if you don't give them the money, I'm not supposed to call you Grandpa. The words felt like a cold piece of iron sliding into my chest. I had spent 33 years in a machine shop working with heavy tools, but I had never felt a blow that hit as hard as those words from a 9-year-old child. Dennis was willing to use his own son's love as a bargaining chip, weaponizing a child's trust to extort a signature. Dennis had stood in the kitchen and told his son that his grandfather's place in the family depended on a signature, and Brenda had stirred the pot roast and said nothing. "Are you going to stop being my grandpa?" Toby asked, a single tear finally breaking free and running down his nose. "Is that what happens if you don't sign?" My throat closed up so tight I had to take a deep, slow breath just to get my voice back. I pulled him into a hug, wrapping my arms around his shivering shoulders. He buried his face in my neck, holding on to me with the desperate strength of a child who was terrified the adults were going to tear his world apart. "No, Toby," I said, my voice thick. "Nobody in the world can make me stop being your grandpa. Not your dad, not anyone. That is a permanent job, buddy. It doesn't depend on any signatures, and it doesn't depend on any money. You hear me?" He nodded against my shoulder, his small chest heaving as he let out a quiet sob. "You're a good kid, Toby," I told him, squeezing him tight. "None of this is your fault. The grown-ups are making a mess. But you don't have to worry about it. You and I are going to be just fine." He pulled back, wiping his face with his sweater sleeve. "Is it because of the money Clifford left?" he asked. "It's about a lot of things," I said. "But none of it is your worry now. I want you to go back inside and put your shoes on, and don't tell your dad or your mom that we talked. Can you do that for me?" "I can do it," he said, his face solemn. He understood that this was a secret that needed protecting. "Go on," I said. He ran back up the walk, slipping through the front door and closing it quietly behind him. I stood in the driveway, looking up at the cold Rockford stars. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and distant. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for weeks finally settled into something hard and cold, like a piece of tempered tool steel. I walked to my car, got in, and started the engine. The heater blew cold air for the first few miles, and my hands were stiff on the steering wheel. I drove through the quiet streets of Rockford, past the dark houses and the empty schoolyards, feeling the massive weight of Clifford's legacy in my pocket. I wasn't just fighting for my own dignity anymore. I was fighting for Toby and for the memory of the only man who had shown me real loyalty. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed. Richard Caldwell answered on the second ring. "Richard," I said, turning the car onto Clement Street. "I know it's Thursday night and it's late, but I think it's time we set a trap." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the rustle of papers in the background. "I was wondering when you'd call, Milton," Caldwell said, his voice calm and entirely unsurprised. "Come to the office tomorrow morning at 8 Plet. And bring Buddy. I'll be there," I said. I hung up the phone and drove back to Mrs. Gable's. When I opened the door to room 7, Buddy was waiting for me. He stood up, stretched his old legs, and walked over to press his head against my hand. I sat on the edge of the bed, and he lay down across my feet, his warm weight grounding me in the quiet room. I took the watch from my dresser and wound it, listening to the tight, clean click of the mainspring. Clifford had spent 38 years building his life, and he had built it on a foundation of loyalty. I was going to make sure that foundation held, no matter what Dennis and Brenda tried to do to break it. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 a.m. to a thick gray fog rolling off the Rock River, blanketing the city of Rockford in a cold, damp shroud. I fed Buddy his breakfast, watched him eat with his usual slow, methodical focus, and then walked him out for a quick, cold stretch. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen when we came back, her arms crossed as she watched me pack a small thermos of coffee. She didn't ask where I was going, but her eyes held a quiet, protective concern that had been completely absent from my daughter's face the night before. At 8 a.m. sharp, I walked into Richard Caldwell's office. Buddy was walking right beside me, his leash slack, his white-muzzled face calm. He immediately trotted over to the corner of Caldwell's desk and curled up on the rug, letting out a long, heavy sigh before going to sleep. I took the leather chair, and Caldwell set a mug of black coffee in front of me. You look like you've had a long night, Milton, Caldwell said, sitting behind his desk. I did, I said. I took a sip of the coffee and then told him everything. I told him about the holiday placemats and the lit candles Brenda had set out on a Thursday night. I told him about Dennis's bourbon-fueled talk about property management and raising rents. I told him about the dry bread roll sitting on the white tablecloth. And then, my voice cracking slightly, I told him about Toby standing on the frozen concrete walk in his socks, crying because his father had told him I wouldn't be his grandfather anymore if I didn't sign their papers. Caldwell listened without interrupting, his pen resting on a yellow legal pad. His expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold and sharp. When I finished, he sat back and tapped his fingers against the desk. They've already moved, Caldwell said. Moved how? I asked. Caldwell turned the legal pad toward me. Brenda and Dennis filed a petition for guardianship in the Winnebago County Probate Court 4 days ago. The day after Brenda came to Mrs. Gables with the casserole, he saw my confusion and explained. Under the Illinois Probate Act, Article 11A, any family member or interested person can petition the court to declare an adult disabled and appoint a guardian to manage their estate. The petition claims that due to your age and cognitive decline, you are unable to make responsible financial decisions. They are asking the court to appoint Brenda as your guardian. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. They're trying to declare me incompetent? Yes, Caldwell said. It requires a physician's evaluation and a formal court hearing. The petition itself doesn't grant them control, but it is the first step. They want you confused, Milton. They want you overwhelmed and dependent on them. Every dinner invitation, every offer to help with the paperwork, it's all designed to build a record showing that you cannot handle this estate alone. How do we fight it? I asked. Looking at the papers, Caldwell reached into his desk drawer and set a small matte black device between us. It was no larger than a thick ink pen with a tiny silver clip on the side. This is a digital recording device, Caldwell said. It has a 14-hour continuous battery life and uploads files automatically to an encrypted cloud server. Under Illinois law, we have specific provisions for recording conversations when there is a reasonable expectation of criminal activity. But more importantly, Illinois is a one-party consent state for recording face-to-face conversations in public or under certain circumstances. I want you to carry this in your pocket. Every conversation you have with Dennis, every telephone call, every pressure tactic they use, I want it documented. I picked up the device. It was incredibly light. We aren't trying to entrap them, Caldwell said. We are simply documenting what they are doing. Every document they put in front of you, every threat they make, goes directly into an evidentiary file for the probate judge. And the guardianship petition? I asked. I have already filed a response on your behalf, Caldwell said. I've scheduled an appointment for you with Dr. Helen Waverly at the Rockford Medical Center. She is one of the most respected neuropsychologists in Northern Illinois. She will conduct an independent cognitive assessment. Once we file her report showing you have 100% capacity, their petition will fall apart. He paused, looking at me steadily. But I want to do more than just defeat the petition, Milton. I want to show the judge exactly who these people are. The probate judge is already aware that Brenda and Dennis are attempting to declare you incompetent at the exact moment you are inheriting a $24.8 million estate. That timing alone is highly suspicious to the court. But if we document their actual behavior, we will have a clear case of coordinated elder financial exploitation under Illinois Criminal Code. I looked down at Buddy, who was snoring softly under the desk. Clifford had spent 4 years building this estate plans, making sure it was secure, because he had known my family better than I did. Clifford knew this would happen, didn't he? I asked. He did, Caldwell said. He told me once that you were too decent for your own good, and that decency was going to need some legal architecture around it eventually. This is that architecture, Milton. I nodded, slipping the matte black device into my flannel shirt pocket, right over my chest. What do we do next, Richard? I asked. You call Brenda, Caldwell said, a thin, cold smile appearing on his lips. You tell her you've been thinking about what she said on the porch. Tell her you're tired, that the paperwork is too much, and you want to come home. Tell her you want to be family again." "They'll move fast," I said. "Yes," Caldwell said. "Men like Dennis move very fast when they think the door is open. And that is exactly when they make mistakes." I sat in my car in the parking lot of Caldwell's office, the matte black recording device secure in my shirt pocket. I pulled out my phone and dialed Brenda's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice tense, probably still recovering from the confrontation at dinner the night before. "Dad?" she said. "Brenda," I said, letting my voice sound heavy and tired, like a man who had finally run out of energy to fight. "I've been thinking about what you said. The boarding house. It's drafty, and my knees are giving me a hard time with the damp air. The lawyers keep sending me these folders of paperwork, and I don't understand half of what's in them. I'm just an old machinist. I can't run a multi-million-dollar business. I think I want to come home." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, a sudden intake of breath. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, the rapid calculations she was making. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice instantly transforming into a sweet, caring register. "I am so glad to hear that. Dennis and I have been sick with worry about you. We hate thinking of you in that rundown place. Of course you should come home. We'll clear out your room right away." "I can pack my things this afternoon," I said. "But Richard Caldwell told me I need to be careful with Buddy. He's Clifford's dog, and the will says I have to keep him." "Bring Buddy, of course," Brenda said quickly. "Toby will be so happy. We'll come pick you up at 3 p.m. Does that work?" "Yes," I said. "That works." I hung up. I reached into my shirt pocket, tapped the top of the black device to ensure the recording had saved and uploaded, and then drove back to Mrs. Gable's to pack. Mrs. Gable watched me load my split suitcase onto the bed. Buddy sat by the door, his tail giving a single, slow wag. "You're going back to them," Mrs. Gable said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just for a little while," I said, not looking at her directly. "There are some things I need to finish." She watched me for a long moment. She was a smart woman, and she knew the world wasn't simple. "Keep your head down, Milton," she said softly. "And if you need a room, room 7 will be waiting. I won't rent it out just yet." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," I said. At 3 p.m. sharp, the Tahoe pulled up to the curb. Dennis was driving, and Brenda was in the passenger seat. Dennis jumped out of the driver's seat, his face beaming with a huge, triumphant grin. He jogged up the walk and grabbed my suitcase. "Let me get that for you, Milton," Dennis said, his voice loud and hearty. "Welcome home, partner. And who's this? Is this Buddy? Hey there, boy." Buddy didn't wag his tail. He stood stiffly by my leg, his head low, letting out a soft, low growl that only I could hear. Dennis didn't notice. He threw the suitcase into the back of the Tahoe and opened the rear door for me and the dog. During the 15-minute drive back to the house, Dennis talked constantly. He was in high spirits, his hands gesturing expansively over the steering wheel. "We're going to get you sorted out, Milton," Dennis said, looking at me in the rearview mirror. "Brenda and I have a great accountant. We're going to sit down tomorrow and go over the commercial lease structures for the storage units. We'll get a power of attorney drawn up so you don't have to deal with Caldwell and his associates. We'll handle the paperwork, and you can just relax and spend time with Toby." "That sounds like a relief," I said, keeping my voice soft and passive. When we arrived at the house, I let Buddy out of the car. Toby was waiting on the porch, his eyes wide. When he saw me, he took a step forward, but he looked at his father first, hesitant. "Go on, Toby," Brenda said. "Grandpa is home." Toby ran down the driveway and threw his arms around my waist, then dropped to his knees to bury his face in Buddy's thick fur. Buddy licked Toby's ear, his tail finally wagging. "All right, let's get you settled," Dennis said, carrying my suitcase toward the side of the house. I followed him, expecting to walk through the front door, but Dennis led me down the concrete path toward the garage. "Now, Milton," Dennis said, pausing at the side door of the garage. "We're still clearing out the guest room. My mother has a few things left in there, and we haven't had time to move the gym equipment from the office. So for the next couple of weeks, we set up the storage room behind the garage for you. It's clean, we put a heater in there, and it's nice and quiet. It'll give you and Buddy your own space." He opened the door. It was the same 8-foot by 10-foot storage room I had lived in before. The walls were bare stud wood, showing the yellow fiberglass insulation. A single cot was set up in the corner, covered by a thin blue blanket. A small space heater sat on the concrete floor, humming loudly. The room smelled of cardboard, old lawnmower gasoline, and damp dust. This was how they welcomed back a man they believed was inheriting a $24.8 million estate. They couldn't even wait 3 days to clear a proper room for me. They wanted the money, but they wanted the old handyman kept in the garage. "It's just temporary, Dad," Brenda said, standing behind Dennis, her eyes charting the cold room. "It's fine," I said, setting my boots on the concrete floor. I reached into my pocket and made sure the recording device was still running. The first night back in the storage room behind the garage was cold, despite the hum of the small space heater. Buddy lay curled up against my legs, sharing his body heat while I stared at the bare rafters overhead. Outside, the wind rattled the metal garage door. I reached up and checked my pocket. The matte black pen was clipped inside my flannel shirt, the tiny green light dark as it sat in standby mode, ready to record at a single tap. Around 8:30 p.m., there was a knock on the side door. "Milton?" Dennis's voice called out. "You awake?" "Yes," I said, sitting up on the cot. The door opened, and Dennis stepped inside, holding a thick manila folder under his arm. Brenda followed him, wearing a thick sweater and holding a pen. They both looked around the small storage room, their eyes scanning the wooden studs in the concrete floor. "We should go inside," Dennis said, rubbing his arms. "It's freezing out here. Let's sit at the kitchen table where it's warm." I stood up, sliding my hands into my pockets, my thumb brushing against the top of the black device. I clicked it once. A faint vibration in the pocket told me it was running. "The living room is better," I said as we walked into the house. "The kitchen radiator has a knock in it. I wanted the living room because the carpet and drapes would absorb the echo, making the audio recording clean and sharp." We sat on the sofa, with Dennis and Brenda sitting opposite me in the leather armchairs. Dennis set the manila folder on the coffee table and opened it. He pulled out a stapled document about 6 pages long and pushed it toward me. "So, Milton," Dennis began, his voice dropping to a smooth, reassuring tone, "Brenda and I had our accountant look over the probate filings. Because of the size of the estate, there's going to be a lot of administrative work over the next few months. Tax filings, employee payroll for the storage units, vendor contracts. It's a lot of stress for someone who's retired." I picked up the document. The cover sheet was headed in bold black letters, "General Power of Attorney, State of Illinois." I held it under the reading lamp, making sure to read the header and the text clearly. "This says General Power of Attorney," I said, reading the words aloud. "It says, it grants Brenda Harmon and Dennis Harmon full authority over all bank accounts, real estate deeds, and commercial holdings." "Yeah, it's just a standard administrative document," Dennis said quickly, waving his hand as if the title didn't matter. "It just allows us to sign papers on your behalf so you don't have to drive down to the bank or the courthouse every time a clerk needs a signature. It's for your protection, Dad. It keeps the lawyers from dragging this out and charging you thousands in fees." Brenda leaned forward, her face full of earnest concern. "Yes, Dad, we just want to take the weight off your shoulders. You've worked hard your whole life. You shouldn't have to deal with court filings and corporate tax structures now." I turned to page 3, reading a specific paragraph aloud. "Paragraph 4, I said, my voice steady. "Authority to sell, lease, transfer, or encumber real property, including the commercial warehouses and self-storage facilities located in Winnebago, Ogle, and Stevenson counties." I looked up at Dennis. "Does this mean you can sell Clifford's businesses without my permission?" Dennis flinched slightly, his smile tightening. "Well, only if it makes financial sense, Milton. For example, if we need to liquidate a warehouse to pay the estate taxes, but we'd always talk to you first. It's just a legal formality so we have the flexibility to manage the assets quickly." "I see," I said. "And the bank accounts?" "The $16, $2 million investment portfolio at First Midwest." "It just gives us signature authority," Dennis said, leaning forward, his eyes bright. so we can transfer funds to cover operating expenses. The restaurants are having a rough patch, and we might need to bridge some cash flow using the estate accounts temporarily. But it's all family money now, Milton. We're all in this together. Once we get this signed, we can get you out of that garage room and into a nice condo. We've already been looking at some places near the country club. He set the pen on the table, pushing it toward my hand. Go ahead and sign on page 6, Dad, Brenda said. We've got a notary friend coming over tomorrow morning to stamp it. We can get it filed by Monday. I held the document in my hands, feeling the weight of their greed. It was a complete surrender of my life and Clifford's legacies. If I signed this, they could sell the storage facilities, empty the investment accounts, and leave me with nothing but the cot in the garage storage room. I'd like to read it over tonight, I said, closing the folder. It's a lot of legal language. Dennis's smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed, a flash of anger crossing his face. Milton, we need to move on this, Dennis said, his voice rising. The probate court moves fast, and if we don't file the administrator papers by Monday, Caldwell is going to control everything. Do you want some lawyer running your life, or do you trust your family? I just want to read it, Dennis, I said. I'll let you know in the morning. I stood up, holding the folder against his chest, and walked back out to the storage room. Through the thin wall, I could hear Dennis's muffled voice in the kitchen, sharp and furious, followed by Brenda's quiet attempts to calm him down. I sat on the cot, pulled the black recording device from my pocket, and tapped the top to save the file. The recording was 22 minutes long. Every word, every explanation, every pressure tactic was now saved in the cloud. On Saturday morning, I woke at 6 a.m. The air inside the garage room was freezing, the small space heater struggling to keep the temperature above 50 degrees. Buddy was already awake, sitting by the door, waiting. I dressed in my clean flannel shirt, checked that the recording device was secure in my pocket, and slipped the manila folder containing the power of attorney under my mattress. I wasn't going to leave it lying around where Dennis might find it. I walked out of the garage side door. The grass was covered in white frost that crunched under my boots. I walked Buddy around the quiet suburban neighborhood where Dennis and Brenda lived. The houses here were large, neo-colonial styles with wide lawns and three-car garages. It was the kind of neighborhood where people kept their blinds drawn and didn't talk to their neighbors. As I walked, I realized that none of these people knew that a man living in a cold storage room behind one of these garages was the sole owner of a $24.8 million estate. I let Buddy sniff a few fire hydrants and then drove my old sedan to the Rockford Medical Center. My appointment with Dr. Helen Waverly was at 9 a.m. The medical center was a massive brick building on the north side of town, the corridors smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. Dr. Waverly's office was on the third floor. She was a woman in her late 50s, with short gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a calm, direct manner that immediately put me at ease. She had my file open on her desk. Mr. Aldridge, thank you for coming, Dr. Waverly said, gesturing to a comfortable chair opposite her. Richard Caldwell explained the situation to me. I understand there is a petition before the probate court regarding your capacity. There is, I said. My daughter and son-in-law believe I can't manage my own affairs. Well, let's see about that, she said, a small, knowing smile appearing on her face. We are going to run through a standard battery of neuropsychological assessments. Some of them might seem simple, even silly, but they help us evaluate different areas of cognitive function: memory, attention, spatial awareness, and executive decision-making. Are you ready? I'm ready, I said. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Waverly put me through the paces. First came the memory tests. She read a list of 15 words and asked me to repeat as many as I could. I repeated 12. Then she asked me to recall them again 20 minutes later after we had done other tasks. I recalled 11. Then came the mathematical and logical tests. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. 193, 86, 79, 72, 65, 58, 51, 44, 37, 30, 23, 16, 9, 2, I said without hesitation. I had spent 33 years calculating tolerances in my head down to the fraction of a millimeter. Subtracting single digits was second nature. She gave me a sheet of paper and asked me to draw a clock face, showing the time at 10 minutes past 11. I drew the circle, placed the numbers precisely at 30-degree angles, and drew the hands with clean, sharp lines. "Your drafting skills are excellent," she noted, looking at the drawing. "I was a toolmaker," I said. "You don't stay in that business long if you can't draw a straight line." She asked me to explain the meaning of common proverbs, to identify patterns in sequences of shapes, and to read a short passage and summarize the main points. I did it all calmly, keeping my voice steady. I could feel the tension that had been locked in my shoulders since the night I was locked out slowly beginning to melt. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't losing my mind. I was just a tired old man who had been pushed around by people who didn't care. "You have remarkable mental resilience, Mr. Aldridge," Dr. Waverly said as she wrote notes on her chart. "Tool and die makers require a high degree of spatial reasoning and working memory, which actually builds a strong cognitive reserve. It protects against the normal wear and tear of aging. Your brain is functioning like a man 20 years younger." When we finished, Dr. Waverly gathered the papers and stacked them neatly on her desk. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, looking at me over her glasses, "your cognitive capacity is in the 98th percentile for your age group. Your memory is sharp, your analytical skills are excellent, and your executive function is completely intact. There is absolutely no clinical basis for a guardianship petition. None." I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you, doctor," I said. "I will write the formal report this afternoon and submit it directly to Richard Caldwell," she said. "Whoever filed that petition was hoping you wouldn't show up to defend yourself. They wanted a default judgment because you were too overwhelmed to fight. But they made a very poor assessment of your character." "They did," I agreed. I walked out of the medical center into the bright Saturday afternoon sun. The air was cold, but it felt clean and good in my lungs. I got into my car and called Caldwell. "Richard," I said, "the assessment is done. Dr. Waverly says I'm clear." "I expected nothing less, Milton," Caldwell said. "I'll have a report filed with the Winnebago County Probate Court clerk first thing Monday morning. That will freeze the guardianship petition. The judge will schedule a hearing, but once they see Waverly's report, they'll dismiss the petition immediately." "So it's over?" I asked. "No," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "The guardianship is dead, but they don't know that yet. They still think they have you cornered in that garage. We need to let them proceed with their plan. If we expose their attempt to exploit you financially, we can secure a permanent injunction against them, protecting your assets and your relationship with Toby permanently. We need one more piece of evidence, Milton. We need them to attempt to execute that power of attorney or take the money." When I pulled into the driveway on Saturday afternoon, Dennis was already waiting outside. He was pacing back and forth on the concrete, a cigarette in his hand. When he saw my sedan, he threw the cigarette butt onto the lawn and walked quickly over to my door. "Where have you been, Milton?" Dennis asked, his voice tight. "We've been calling your phone. Brenda's notary friend is going to be here in 30 minutes. Did you read the power of attorney?" "I did," I said, getting out of the car. I reached down to pat Buddy's head as he climbed out of the back seat. "I read every page, and—" Dennis leaned in, his eyes searching my face. "We good to go?" "I have some conditions, Dennis," I said, walking toward the garage side door. Dennis followed me, his boots clicking on the concrete, his tone instantly becoming defensive. "Conditions? Milton, we're your family. We're trying to help you." "What kind of conditions?" "First," I said, turning to face him at the door of the storage room, "I want a $1 million educational trust fund set up for Toby. It must be structured so that he is the sole beneficiary, and the funds can only be accessed for his college or vocational training. Neither you nor Brenda can touch the principal." Dennis's jaw tightened. He stared at me for a second, a flash of resentment in his eyes, but then he quickly masked it with a wave of his hand. "Fine, sure, we can set that up next week. It's a great idea, actually. What else?" "Second," I said, "Philip Dawson stays as the general manager of the Vance Self-Storage Group. The will says Clifford wanted the businesses run as they are, and Philip has been doing a good job for 11 years. I don't want you raising the rents by 15% like you said at dinner, and I don't want you changing vendor contracts without his approval." Dennis let out a short, dry laugh. "Milton, you're letting these employees dictate terms to you. But if it makes you comfortable, fine. We won't touch Dawson's position for now. We can write all of this into a side agreement later. But right now, we need to sign the general power of attorney. The court filings are due, and we can't afford to wait." At that moment, a blue Ford Explorer pulled into the driveway. A man in his late 30s got out, carrying a small leather bag. He was wearing a golf shirt and khakis. "Todd, hey man," Dennis called out, his voice instantly switching back to his loud, friendly barbecue tone. "Hey Dennis," Todd said, walking over and shaking his hand. "I've got the seal. Ready to get this stamped?" "Yeah, we're ready," Dennis said. "Let's go into the dining room." We walked inside. Brenda was waiting at the table, a fresh pot of coffee set out. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. Dennis set the manila folder on the table and pulled out the power of attorney document. He pushed the signature page toward me and handed me a pen. I sat down. I reached into my shirt pocket, tapped the top of the black device to make sure it was running, and then looked at Todd. "Todd," I said, keeping my voice quiet and measured, "you are a licensed notary public in the state of Illinois?" "Yes, sir, I am," Todd said, pulling a heavy brass stamp from his bag. "I've been registered with the Secretary of State's office for 8 years. And you are here to witness my signature on this document?" I asked. "That's correct," Todd said, looking a bit surprised by my questioning. "Dennis said you wanted this notarized today, so they could handle the probate paperwork. I just want to be clear," I said, looking down at the page. "I am signing this General Power of Attorney, Illinois Form 43, granting Brenda Harmon and Dennis Harmon full authority over all my financial assets, including the Vance Self-Storage Group and my accounts at First Midwest Bank." "Yes, Milton, we know what the document is," Dennis interrupted, his voice sharp with impatience. "Let's just get it signed. Todd is on a tight schedule." "I am signing this because my family has assured me it is for my protection," I said, looking directly at Brenda. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I took the pen, held it to the signature line, and wrote my name. Milton Aldridge. The steel nib scratched against the paper, a quiet sound in the silent room. On my left wrist, under the sleeve of my flannel shirt, Clifford's old manual watch ticked steadily. It felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that while Dennis was planning his theft, the gears of a much larger machine were already turning. I pushed the document toward Todd. He checked my driver's license, verified the name, and then pressed his brass stamp onto the ink pad before bringing it down hard onto the paper. The heavy click of the metal seal was loud in the quiet room, a final, official sound that sealed their plan. Dennis grabbed the folder the second Todd finished stamping it. He didn't even wait for the ink to dry. He held it against his chest, his face lit up with a look of pure, unchecked triumph. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery, his breathing shallow and quick. "Thanks, Todd," Dennis said, shaking the notary's hand. "I appreciate you coming out on a Saturday." "No problem, Dennis," Todd said, packing his stamp. "Let me know if you need anything else." After Todd left, Dennis turned to Brenda, a cold, businesslike tone returning to his voice. "I'm going to take this to the bank on Monday morning," Dennis said. "I'll meet with the regional manager at the East State Street branch. We'll get the signatory cards changed, and then we'll call Caldwell's office to let them know we are taking over the administration of the estate." "What about my room, Brenda?" I asked. "The cot in the garage is very cold." Brenda looked at Dennis, then at me. We're still working on it, Dad. Just give us a few more days." Sunday passed in a quiet, tense waiting. I spent most of the day in the storage room, brushing Buddy's thick coat and listening to the cold wind scrape against the garage wall. Toby came out twice, bringing me a cup of warm apple cider that Mrs. Gable had shown him how to make, and we sat on the cot together talking about his school projects. He kept his promise. He didn't say a word about our talk on the driveway, but every time Dennis's heavy footsteps sounded in the kitchen above us, Toby would look toward the ceiling, his small body tensing. Monday morning came, cold and clear. At 8:15 a.m., I heard Dennis's Tahoe start up in the driveway. Through the single window of the storage room, I watched the large black vehicle back out and speed down the street, its exhaust plumes white in the freezing morning air. He was heading for the bank at 9:30 a.m. My phone rang. The caller ID showed First Midwest Bank, Rockford, Maine branch. I slides my thumb across the screen and put the phone to my ear, ensuring the matte black recording device in my pocket was active. Milton Aldridge speaking, I said. Mr. Aldridge, this is Carol Birch. The voice was quiet, professional, and held a distinct undercurrent of concern. Carousel was the fiduciary advisor who had managed Clifford's investment portfolio for nearly 10 years. I am calling from my office at the East State Street branch. I have your son-in-law, Dennis Harmon, here with me. I see, I said, keeping my voice calm. He has presented a general power of attorney document, signed by you and notarized on Saturday, Carol continued. He is requesting an immediate wire transfer of $1.50 million from the Vance Estate portfolio accounts to a commercial checking account under the name Harmon Restaurant Group. He claims this transfer is for administrative restructuring and tax preparation. Because of the size of the transfer and the nature of the recipient account, my fiduciary duties require me to verify this transaction directly with the executor. Do you authorize this wire transfer, Mr. Aldridge? I leaned against the wooden workbench, my fingers closing around the cold steel of a wrench. No, Carol, I said, my voice steady. I do not authorize any wire transfers, and I do not authorize any changes to the signature cards or access rights on any of the Vance Estate accounts. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint click of a keyboard. Understood, Mr. Aldridge, Carol said. I will place an immediate administrative freeze on all accounts associated with the Vance Self-Storage Group, the warehouse parks, and the investment portfolio. No transactions will be processed. Where is Dennis right now? I asked. He is waiting in the reception lobby, Carol said. He was quite insistent that the transfer be completed within the hour. He told my assistant that you were bedridden and unable to make the trip yourself. A cold smile touched my lips. I am not bedridden, Carol. I am on my way to the bank right now. Please tell Dennis that I am coming to meet him. I will do that, she said. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed Richard Caldwell's office. He answered on the first ring before his secretary could even pick up. Caldwell, he said. Dennis is at First Midwest on East State Street, I told him. He just tried to wire $1.50 million from the investment accounts to his restaurant group. Carol Birch has frozen the accounts. Perfect, Caldwell said, his tone turning crisp and authoritative. He has attempted to execute the transaction. That is the final piece of evidence we need. It establishes the criminal intent for elder financial exploitation. I've already contacted Detective Robert Miller at the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department. He has the file I compiled over the weekend, including your audio recordings from Friday night. I will meet you at the bank in 15 minutes. Do not enter the building until I arrive. I'm on my way, I said. I walked out of the garage, leaving Buddy in the warmth of the kitchen with Brenda, who was busy folding laundry. She looked up as I walked through the kitchen, a startled expression on her face. Dad? Where are you going? She asked, setting down a towel. Dennis said you should rest today. I have some business at the bank, Brenda, I said, not stopping. But Dennis said he was handling the bank. She called after me, her voice rising with panic. I didn't answer. I got into my sedan, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. As I drove down the street, I could see Brenda standing on the porch. Her phone pressed to her ear, desperately trying to call her husband. The drive to the East State Street branch took 12 minutes. As I drove, I passed the warehouse park on 11th Street, the first one Clifford had ever bought back in 1994. I remembered the day he closed the deal. He had called me to drink a beer on the hood of his truck in the empty parking lot, telling me that one day we'd both be retired and wouldn't have to sweep iron chips off the shop floor ever again. Now, he was gone, and I was driving to save what he had built from a thief. The bank was a modern, brick building with large glass windows. I parked my sedan near the back of the lot and sat in the driver's seat, watching the main entrance as my hands rested on the steering wheel. 2 minutes later, Richard Caldwell's charcoal Mercedes pulled into the lot, parking right next to me. He got out, carrying his leather briefcase, his expression hard and focused. As we walked toward the glass doors of the bank together, a white Winnebago County Sheriff's patrol car pulled into the parking lot, its lights off, but moving with a quiet urgency. "It's time to finish this, Milton," Caldwell said, opening the door. We walked through the heavy glass doors of the First Midwest Bank branch on East State Street. The lobby was bright with tall marble pillars and the quiet hum of customer service clerks explaining mortgage rates. Sitting in one of the leather armchairs near the receptionist's desk was Dennis. He was bouncing his knee rapidly, staring at his phone, his face red and tense. When the glass doors whistled open and he looked up, his jaw dropped. Dennis stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the polished tile floor. Several bank customers turned to look at him. He tried to plaster a fake, wide smile over his panic, but his eyes were darting from me to Richard Caldwell. "Milton, what are you doing here?" Dennis asked, his voice cracking slightly before he lowered it to a tight, aggressive whisper. "I told you I was handling the bank accounts. Brenda said you were resting in your room. You shouldn't be out in this cold." "I am here because Carol Birch called me, Dennis," I said, keeping my voice loud enough to carry across the open lobby. "She wanted to know if I authorized a wire transfer of $1. $50 million from the Vance estate to the Harmon Restaurant Group." Dennis's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy purple. He took 2 quick steps toward us, trying to position himself between me and the office door where Carol Birch worked. "Look, Milton," Dennis stammered, his hands moving in frantic gestures. "It's just a temporary cash management transfer. We discussed this at the dinner table, remember? To optimize the tax brackets and help with the restaurant cash flow. It's all for the family, Milton. We're going to transfer it back once the probate is finalized. I've got the paperwork right here. Let's just go into Carol's office. You sign the transfer slip and we'll get this sorted out." "Mr. Harmon," Caldwell said, stepping forward. He held his leather briefcase in front of him like a shield. "You are not authorized to conduct any transactions on behalf of this estate. The general power of attorney you presented was obtained under duress and false pretenses." "Who the hell are you to talk to me like that?" Dennis hissed, taking a step toward Caldwell, his fists clenches at his sides. "I have a notarized power of attorney signed by Milton himself. It is a legal document and it is active." "Milton, tell this lawyer to back off. We are family. We don't need some suit telling us how to manage our money." "No, Dennis," I said. "We aren't family. Not anymore." I reached into my flannel shirt pocket, pulled out the matte black digital recorder, and held it up between us. "I didn't sign that document because I wanted you to have Clifford's money," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I signed it because you stood in your kitchen and told my 9-year-old grandson that he couldn't call me Grandpa anymore if I didn't give you my estate. I signed it because you locked me out in the rain and because you kept me in a cold storage room behind your garage. And I have every single threat, every single explanation, and every single manipulation recorded right here." Dennis stared at the black device, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. You old bastard," Dennis whispered, his voice trembling. "You recorded me?" "He did," Caldwell said, "and under Illinois law, those recordings are fully admissible in a criminal proceeding when there is a reasonable expectation of exploitation. We have already uploaded the files to the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department." Before Dennis could speak, the glass doors behind us opened again. Detective Robert Miller and a uniformed sheriff's deputy stepped into the lobby. Detective Miller was a tall, stern-faced man in a dark trench coat. He took one look at Dennis, then at me, and walked straight over. "Dennis Harmon?" Detective Miller asked. "What is this?" Dennis said, his voice rising to a panic-stricken shriek. "Milton, tell them to stop. Brenda, she's your daughter. You're destroying our family. Mr. Harmon, you are under arrest for coordinated financial exploitation of an elderly person under Illinois Criminal Code 720, ILCS 51756. Detective Miller said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Step away from the desk and place your hands behind your back." The deputy grabbed Dennis's arm, spinning him around and clicking the steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Dennis was trembling, his face completely white now, tears of anger and fear starting to run down his cheeks. He looked at me, his eyes full of pure, unchecked hatred as the deputy led him toward the door. "You're going to regret this, Milton," Dennis screamed as they pushed him through the glass doors. "You hear me? You're going to regret this." I watched them lead him out to the patrol car in the parking lot. The bank lobby was completely silent now, every customer and teller staring at me. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and a deep, quiet peace. I remembered when Brenda was a little girl, only 7 years old, and she had caught a bad fever. I had sat by her bedside for 3 days, sponge bathing her forehead, terrified of losing her. I had worked double shifts at the machine shop for 6 months just to pay off the medical bills and buy her the blue Schwinn bicycle she wanted for Christmas. I had poured my life into that girl. To see her stand in the kitchen and allow her husband to treat me like an obsolete part was a pain no court could ever heal. But the steel had to be cut, and the work had to be done. Carol Birch walked out of her glass office, holding a stack of file folders. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she approached us. "Are you all right, Mr. Aldridge?" she asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. "I have a glass of water in my office if you'd like to sit down." "I'm all right, Carol," I said. "Thank you for making the call." "It was my duty, Milton," she said, looking toward the glass doors where the police car lights were still flashing. "Clifford trusted you completely. I wasn't about to let someone tear down what he spent his life building. I've filed the formal freeze on all the accounts. The power of attorney Dennis had is legally voided as of this moment." I felt the watch ticking on my wrist, Clifford's watch, and for the first time in 14 months, I felt like the air in my lungs was clean. Richard Caldwell walked me out to the parking lot. The fog had mostly cleared, leaving the sky a flat, cold blue. The sheriff's patrol car had already departed, its siren silent but its task completed. I stood by my old sedan, my keys in my hand, feeling the chill of the Rockford air. "You shouldn't go back to that house, Milton," Caldwell said, his hand on my shoulder. "Brenda is going to be frantic, and she'll try to put the blame on you. I've already called Mrs. Gable. Room 7 is ready for you. I'll have Philip Dawson send a couple of movers from the storage facility to retrieve your clothes, your dog, and your belongings from the garage room. You don't need to face her right now." "No, Richard," I said, shaking my head. "I need to get Buddy myself. He doesn't know those movers, and he's an old dog. He'd get scared. And I need to see Toby. I need to make sure he understands that I didn't break my promise." Hal studied me for a second, then nodded slowly. "All right, but keep your phone on. If she tries to block you or gets aggressive, you call me immediately. I'll have a deputy dispatched back to the house." "I'll be fine," I said. I got into my sedan and drove back to the house. The drive felt longer this time, every street corner familiar but cold. When I pulled into the driveway, Brenda's silver SUV was parked at a crooked angle, the driver's side door still slightly ajar. She had rushed home. I climbed out of the car. Before I could even close my door, the front door of the house flew open. Brenda ran down the front walk. Her hair was messy, her eyes red and puffy, her face smeared with tears. She didn't look like the polished, well-dressed woman who had brought the beef stew to my porch. She looked terrified, desperate, and furious. "Dad," she screamed, her voice cracking as she reached the driveway. "What did you do?" "The police just called me from the downtown station. They arrested Dennis. They said he's being charged with felony elder exploitation and financial abuse. They said his bail is set at $100,000. Dad, how could you do this to us? He's your son-in-law. He is the man who tried to steal Clifford's estate, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "He was just trying to help," she sobbed, throwing her hands in the air. "The restaurants are failing, Dad. We have 3 months of back mortgage payments on this house. The lease on the Tahoe is past due. We were going to lose everything, and you have millions now. $24.8 million. You don't even need it. Why couldn't you just let him manage it? Why did you have to call the police and destroy my family? You're going to put Toby's father in prison." I stood by my car door, looking at my daughter. The red flush on her face and the desperation in her voice were real, but it wasn't grief for our broken relationship. It was the panic of a thief who had just realized the lock was stronger than they thought. Dennis didn't care about Toby's father when he stood in the kitchen and threatened to forbid my grandson from calling me Grandpa. Brenda, I said. He was willing to use a 9-year-old child's love as a lever to pry open my bank accounts, and you stood there and said nothing. He was just stressed, she cried, taking a step toward me, her hands clenching. He didn't mean it. You know how Dennis gets when he's stressed. He just talks big. He would never actually do that. He did it, Brenda, I said, and you let him. You gave me a stale roll and put me in a garage. You sold my house, took my $150,000, and treated me like an obsolete machine tool that was cluttering up your basement. You didn't want a father. You wanted a servant who didn't ask questions and didn't cost anything. Brenda froze. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the tears still running down her face, but the anger suddenly dying out, replaced by a cold, hollow look of realization. I'm taking my dog and my clothes, I said, walking past her toward the garage side door. Dad, please, she whispered, her voice suddenly small and childlike. We can't pay the mortgage without help. They're going to foreclose. Richard Caldwell will handle any communication regarding the estate, I said, not looking back. If you need financial help, your lawyer can contact him. I opened the garage side door. Buddy was waiting inside, sitting by the cot, his head cocked. When he saw me, his tail immediately started to wag in a slow, happy circle. I reached down, clicked the leash onto his collar, and patted his side. Let's go home, boy, I told him. I packed my flannel shirts and Martha's photograph back into the split suitcase, zipped it shut, and carried it out. When I stepped back into the kitchen to grab Buddy's water bowl, Toby was standing in the doorway leading to the hall. He was holding his school backpack, his eyes wide and full of tears. He had heard everything. I set the suitcase down and crouched down in front of him. Buddy trotted over and nudged Toby's hand with his wet nose. Grandpa, Toby whispered, a single tear running down his cheek. I'm right here, Toby, I said, taking his small hands in mine. I'm going back to Mrs. Gable's house on Clement Street. Buddy is coming with me. Is Dad going to jail? He asked. Your dad made some bad mistakes, Toby, I said softly. The police have to talk to him about it. But I want you to remember what I told you on the driveway last week. I am always going to be your grandpa, no matter where I live, and no matter what the grown-ups do. You can call Mrs. Gable's phone anytime you want, and I'll come pick you up for ice cream. We're still partners, okay? Toby nodded once, his chin trembling, and then threw his arms around my neck. I hugged him tight, burying my face in his shoulder, holding on to the only clean thing left in that family. I love you, Grandpa, he whispered. I love you too, Toby, I said. I stood up, picked up my suitcase, and walked out of the house with Buddy by my side. Brenda was still sitting on the porch steps, her face buried in her hands, weeping as the cold Rockford wind blew the dry leaves across her feet. I didn't look back as I loaded the suitcase into the trunk and drove away. Returning to Mrs. Gable's house felt like walking back into a shelter after a long, freezing storm. Room 7 was exactly as I had left it, the radiator knocking and hissing, the blue quilt folded neatly on the bed. Buddy immediately walked over to the corner, lay down on the small rug, and let out a long, weathering sigh of relief. He was home. Mrs. Gable came up a few minutes later, carrying a tray with a bowl of chicken noodle soup and a plate of fresh biscuits. I heard the sirens downtown, she said, setting the tray on the dresser. The postman said they took Dennis out of the bank in cuffs. They did, I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Eat your soup, Milton, she said, giving Buddy a soft pat on the head. You've done the hard work. Now let the lawyers sweep up the chips. Over the next 3 weeks, the scale of my new life began to settle in. I spent my mornings with Philip Dawson, visiting the self-storage facilities and the light industrial parks. I had worked in machine shops my whole life. But walking through these warehouse bays, checking the structural steel and the high-capacity cranes, I realized that Clifford had built a small empire. On our second day, Philip took me to the back of the largest facility on Harrison Avenue. He unlocked a heavy steel door that wasn't listed on the tenant maps. Inside was a complete vintage machine shop, a Bridgeport milling machine, a South Bend lathe, and rows of carefully arranged drawers containing micrometers, calipers, and carbide cutters. It was spotless. Every machine was wiped down, smelling of clean oil, their ways protected by grease paper. Clifford set this up 6 years ago. Philip told me, watching my face. He told me that if the commercial real estate business ever got too noisy, he wanted a place where he could come and hear himself think. He said the only time he ever felt like he was doing honest work was when he was standing at a lathe with Milton Aldridge. He kept your old toolboxes here, Milton, the ones you sold to pay for Martha's treatments. Clifford bought them back from the pawn shop the next day. I walked over to the wooden bench. Sure enough, my old Kennedy toolbox with my initials M.A. stamped in the brass lock plate was sitting there. I touched the worn steel handle, my eyes blurring. Clifford had kept my tools safe, waiting for the day I'd come back to them. He never forgot, Milton, Philip said softly. No, I whispered. He didn't. We also met with Carol Birch at First Midwest Bank to formally organize the investment accounts. The power of attorney Dennis had presented was officially voided, and a court-supervised freeze was placed on the main accounts to prevent any ad hoc transfers. Under Carol's guidance, we executed the first administrative draft from the estate. We set up Toby's $1 million educational trust fund. I want this fund to be ironclad, Carol, I told her as we sat in her office. I want it structured so that Toby can go to any school he wants, whether it's an engineering college or a trade school. If he wants to be a trade school graduate or an engineer, if he wants to be a toolmaker like his grandpa, I want his tools paid for. I don't want his parents using this money to pay off their restaurant leases or their country club fees. It's for the boy's mind and nothing else. I understand, Milton, Carol said. We will structure it with a corporate trustee. The funds will be paid directly to the institutions or the vendors, completely bypassing the parents' accounts. Dennis and Brenda won't even receive the statements. Good, I said. Toby's future was secure, no matter what happened to his parents' finances. Meanwhile, the legal gears began to grind. Dennis remained in the Winnebago County Jail, unable to raise the $100,000 cash bail. His personal accounts and the Harmon Restaurant Group accounts were frozen or overdrawn, and his business partners had already filed for emergency receivership of the franchise restaurants. Because he couldn't afford a private attorney, the court appointed a public defender, a tired young woman who looked at the stack of audio recordings and Dr. Waverly's report and sighed. Brenda, however, was desperate. She had hired a cheap family lawyer, a man named Marcus Vance, who was known in Rockford for dragging out custody battles and filing frivolous probate claims. Marcus Vance filed an emergency motion in the probate court, challenging Dr. Helen Waverly's capacity assessment. The motion claimed that I was suffering from undue influence from Richard Caldwell and Philip Dawson, and that the neuropsychological evaluation was conducted under false pretenses while I was in a state of cognitive distress. They were asking the court to order a second, court-appointed evaluation and to freeze all executor payouts. Richard Caldwell laughed when he received the court notice. He called me into his office on Thursday afternoon, showing me the copy of the motion. This is pure desperation, Milton, Caldwell said, leaning back in his leather chair. Dr. Waverly's report is 14 pages of detailed clinical data. She is the former head of the State Board of Neuropsychology. The judge, Judge Arthur Pendleton, knows her work well. Marcus Vance is trying to throw mud at the wall to see if any of it sticks, hoping we'll pay them a settlement to make them go away. I'm not settling, Richard, I said. I didn't think you would, Caldwell smiled. The probate hearing is scheduled for next Thursday at 10:00 a.m. at the Winnebago County Courthouse. The judge is going to review Dr. Waverly's report, our digital audio recordings, the bank transaction logs, and the power of attorney. I want you to be in that courtroom, Milton. I want Brenda and her lawyer to look at the man they tried to lock in a garage. I'll be there, I said. I spent the weekend preparing myself. I walked Buddy down Clement Street, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall, the white flakes dusting the old houses. I felt the watch ticking on my wrist, Clifford's watch, and I knew that next Thursday the machine would finally finish its cut. The Winnebago County Courthouse was a heavy stone building built in the 1920s, its tall arched windows looking out over the gray, snow-dusted roofs of downtown Rockford. The hallways smelled of old marble, wet coats, and radiator steam. I walked down the corridor of the fourth floor with Richard Caldwell. I was wearing my best dark suit, the one I had bought for Martha's funeral, and my boots were clean. On my wrist, Clifford's manual watch ticked under my cuff, a steady, rhythmic companion. We walked into courtroom 402C. Sitting at the petitioner's table on the left was Brenda. She was wearing a dark, simple dress, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked smaller than she had in her kitchen, her face pale and her eyes nervously charting the wood-paneled room. Beside her was Marcus Vance. He was a short, round man with slick-back black hair and a gold watch that looked slightly too large for his wrist. He was shuffling a stack of papers, trying to look busy and important, but he didn't look up when we entered. Richard Caldwell and I took our seats at the respondent's table on the right. At exactly 10 a.m., the bailiff stood. All rise. The Honorable Judge Arthur Pendleton presiding. Judge Pendleton walked in from his chambers. He was a man in his late 60s, with a thick head of white hair and a sharp, weather-worn face. He had been a probate judge in this county for 22 years, and he had a reputation for being a no-nonsense jurist who could see through a bad argument within 3 sentences. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the files on his desk. "This is case number 2026, CH0482, Judge Pendleton said, his voice deep and dry. "In the matter of the estate of Clifford Vance and the emergency petition for guardianship of Milton Aldridge, I see the petitioners are represented by Mr. Marcus Vance and the respondent is represented by Mr. Richard Caldwell. Mr. Vance, since you filed the motion to contest the capacity assessment and request a secondary evaluation, you may proceed." Marcus Vance stood up, buttoning his jacket. He took a step toward the center of the courtroom, holding his hands out in an expressive gesture. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus Vance said, his voice theatrical. "We represent Brenda Harmon, the respondent's sole daughter. During the 14 months Mr. Aldridge lived with her, she observed severe cognitive decline. He could not manage daily tasks and suffered significant memory lapses. Upon Clifford Vance's death, the executor, Richard Caldwell, and the manager, Philip Dawson, rushed him to a private clinic for a capacity assessment to secure their own positions. We asked the court to invalidate Dr. Waverly's assessment, order a new evaluation, and appoint Brenda Harmon as temporary guardian." Judge Pendleton listened without moving a muscle in his face. He rested his chin on his hand. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, "do you have any medical documentation to support these claims? A physician's report? A diagnostic record?" Marcus Vance cleared his throat. "Well, Your Honor, the respondent's counsel has blocked our client from accessing her father, preventing us from obtaining an evaluation. But we have a sworn affidavit from Brenda Harmon." "I see," Judge Pendleton said. He turned his eyes toward our table. "Mr. Caldwell?" Richard Caldwell stood up calmly. He didn't carry any papers with him. He just rested his hands on the back of his chair. "Your Honor, we have submitted Dr. Helen Waverly's assessment showing Mr. Aldridge has a cognitive capacity in the 98th percentile," Caldwell said. "But more importantly, we have physical evidence refuting the petitioner's claims of care." Caldwell reached into his briefcase and held up a digital tablet. "We have submitted 3 audio files from late October," Caldwell said. "They captured Dennis Harmon threatening to deny Mr. Aldridge access to his grandson, Toby, unless he signed a power of attorney. The recordings also show his plan to immediately drain $1.5 million to pay personal debts. We have also submitted police reports of Mr. Harmon's arrest at First Midwest Bank, and photos proving the petitioners forced Mr. Aldridge to live in an uninsulated garage room while preparing this guardianship claim." The courtroom went completely silent. Brenda's head dropped. She stared at her lap, her hands shaking violently. Marcus Vance turned to look at her, his face turning a shade of pale gray. He hadn't known about the garage, or perhaps he hadn't known we had photographs. Judge Pendleton leaned forward, his eyes turning to cold steel as he stared down at the petitioner's table. The folders on his desk remained open, but his pen was already poised over the order sheet. "Mr. Marcus Vance," Judge Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register, "did you review the Sheriff's Department arrest logs before filing this emergency motion?" Your Honor," Marcus Vance stammered, his forehead sweating. I was not fully aware of the criminal proceedings involving Mr. Harmon, my client assured me. Your client lied to you, Mr. Vance. Judge Pendleton interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a cold blade. And you have brought a frivolous, bad faith motion into this court in an attempt to facilitate the financial exploitation of an elderly citizen. I have reviewed Dr. Waverly's report. It is comprehensive, objective, and definitive. I have also reviewed the audio transcripts. The behavior documented in those files is not only repugnant, it is criminal. Judge Pendleton picked up his pen and signed the order sheet with a heavy, scratching sound. The emergency petition for guardianship is dismissed with prejudice. Judge Pendleton ruled. The motion to contest capacity is denied. I am referring the transcripts of this hearing and the submitted audio files to the Winnebago County State's Attorney for immediate review of coordinated financial exploitation of an elderly person under 720 ILCS 51756, targeting both Dennis Harmon and Brenda Harmon. Furthermore, Mr. Marcus Vance, I am ordering your client to pay all attorney fees and court costs incurred by the respondent for this motion. This court is adjourned. The heavy strike of the judge's gavel echoed through courtroom 402 like a gunshot. Judge Pendleton stood up and walked out of the room, his black robes billowing behind him. I sat at the table, my hands flat on the polished oak. I looked across the room at Brenda. She had collapsed forward, her face buried in her arms on the table, her shoulders shaking with silent, desperate sobs. Marcus Vance was already packing his leather bag, not looking at her, his only concern being his own departure before the storm hit. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and looked at Clifford's watch. It was 10:14 a.m. The steel had been cut and the line was straight. As I walked out of the courtroom, Brenda's lawyer, Marcus Vance, brushed past us without a word, his leather heels clicking rapidly on the marble corridor before disappearing toward the elevators. I stopped near the heavy glass windows at the end of the hall, looking down at the quiet street below. A light snow was falling now, turning the gray asphalt white. I heard a soft, hesitant step behind me. I turned. Brenda was standing there, her coat draped over her arm, her face blotchy and red. Her eyes were wide, empty of the pride she had carried in her kitchen. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dad, wait, please." I stood still, my hands in my coat pockets, my fingers brushing against the cold digital recorder. I didn't say anything. I just watched her. "Please, Dad," she begged, taking a step closer, her hands reaching out but stopping before she touched me. "Don't let them prosecute me. The state's attorney, they'll look at those recordings. Dennis is already going to prison. His public defender told him he'll likely get 6 years for the fraud. If they indict me too, what will happen to Toby? The bank is foreclosing on the house. The restaurants are gone. If I go to jail, Toby will have no one. He'll go into the state system. You should have thought about Toby when you let Dennis stand in your kitchen and tell my grandson he couldn't call me Grandpa." "Brenda," I said, my voice quiet but hard, "you should have thought about Toby when you stood in the hallway and let Dennis throw my suitcase into the rain." "I was terrified," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Dennis was drowning in restaurant debt. He was shouting at me every night, saying we'd be bankrupt by winter. I thought if we got the power of attorney, we could just borrow a little bit to clear the loans and then pay it back. I didn't know he was going to lock you out. I didn't want you in the garage, Dad, I swear. I didn't have the strength to fight him. I'm your daughter." I looked at her, and the sorrow in my chest was very old, a weight I had carried since before Martha passed. I remembered the little girl who used to sit on my workbench, playing with brass washers while I ran the lathe. I had loved that girl with everything I had. But love without boundaries is just a design waiting to fail. "You are my daughter, Brenda," I said. "And because you are my daughter, I asked Richard Caldwell to speak to the state's attorney this morning before the hearing. If you cooperate with the prosecution against Dennis, they will offer you a plea bargain. 5 years of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service. No prison time." Brenda let out a gasping breath, her hand flying to her mouth, her shoulders relaxing by a fraction. Thank you, Dad. Don't thank me," I said, looking her in the eye. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because Toby needs a mother who isn't behind bars, but you are going to lose the house, and you are going to have to find an honest job to pay off Marcus Vance and your debts. The country club life is over, Brenda." "I know," she whispered, looking down at the marble floor. "And one more thing," I said. "Toby is going to spend every weekend with me. I've bought a house on the east side, with a fenced yard for Buddy. If you try to block him from seeing me, or if you tell him anything that makes him feel guilty for loving his grandfather, Richard Caldwell will file for emergency custody within an hour. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Go home, Brenda," I said. I turned and walked toward the elevators, where Richard Caldwell was waiting for me, his briefcase in hand. Over the next month, the changes happened quickly. Dennis pleaded guilty to felony financial exploitation and bank fraud, receiving a sentence of 6 years at the Sheridan Correctional Center. The suburban house was foreclosed by the bank, and Brenda moved into a modest, 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of town, taking a job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic. I closed on the Craftsman House on Rockford's historic east side. It was an old house, built in 1916, with thick white oak trim, a covered front porch, and a massive red oak tree in the backyard. Buddy loved it. He spent his afternoons lying on the rug in the sunlit parlor, his tail giving a soft thump against the wood whenever I walked past. On the first Saturday of December, I picked Toby up for his first weekend visit. We didn't go to the toy store or the movies. I took him straight to the Harrison Avenue warehouse facility, to the secret machine shop Clifford had left for me. The room was warm, the Bridgeport mill and the South Bend lathe shining under the fluorescent lights. Toby stood in the doorway, his eyes wide as he looked at the racks of steel stock and the rows of drawers. "Is this yours, Grandpa?" Toby asked, his voice full of awe. "It's ours, Toby," I said. I walked over to the workbench and lifted my old Kennedy toolbox onto the wood, sliding the drawers open. The micrometers and steel rules were right where I had left them years ago, oiled and clean. I reached in and pulled out a small block of walnut wood. "Come here, Buddy," I said, gesturing to the South Bend lathe. "I'm going to teach you how to turn a wooden spinning top. You have to measure the diameter down to the thousandth of an inch. If it's not balanced, it won't spin." Toby jogged over, his face lit up with a bright, clean smile. I helped him step up onto a wooden box so he could reach the carriage handwheel. Buddy lay down by the workbench, his chin resting on his paws, watching us with his cloudy, peaceful eyes. The motor of the lathe hummed to life, a quiet, steady sound that filled the warm room. I put my hand over Toby's small fingers, guiding the tool bit toward the spinning wood, and for the first time in 14 months, I felt like the machine was running exactly as it was designed to. 8 months later, in the warm, bright days of early July, the probate court of Winnebago County officially declared the estate of Clifford Vance closed. The legal transfers were completed, the administrative signatures finalized, and the $24.8 million estate was fully settled under my name. I remember sitting in Richard Caldwell's office for the last official signature. The formal charcoal suit was gone. Richard was wearing a casual blue shirt, the windows behind him open to the summer breeze. "It's done, Milton," Richard had said, sliding the final decree across the glass desk. "You are the sole owner of the Vance Storage Group and the investment portfolio. The court-supervised administration is dissolved. You're a free man." I had picked up the paper, looking at the county clerk's red seal. "Clifford made sure of that, didn't he?" "He did," Richard had nodded. "He knew you'd handle it with the same precision you used at the shop. He'd be proud of how you handled this, Milton. You didn't let the bitterness warp your measurements." "Bitter steel snaps under load, Richard," I had said, folding the paper, tempered steel flexes. I just did the work. But, walking down Clement Street on a Saturday morning, my life didn't feel any different. I still wore my scuffed boots and my faded flannel shirts. I still drove my old sedan, the motor hum sounding just as reliable as it had when Martha was sitting in the passenger seat. I hadn't moved into a condo near the country club, and I hadn't bought a luxury car. I lived in the Craftsman House on the east side, spending my evenings reading the paper on the porch, and my mornings pruning the red oak tree. The storage businesses and the warehouse parks were running smoothly. Philip Dawson managed the operations, keeping the facilities clean and the occupancy rates high. Once a week, Philip and I would sit down at the desk in his Harrison Avenue office, reviewing the accounts over a cup of black coffee. We were running the business the way Clifford had: fair prices, clean leases, and absolute honesty. Toby was doing well. He was 10 now, his school grades steady and his eyes bright. The educational trust fund was fully active, paying his tuition directly to his private school and setting aside enough to cover any college he chose. He had grown 3 inches over the winter, his shoulders widening, looking more like my side of the family every day. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the Rockford Memorial Cemetery. Buddy was sitting in the front seat beside me, his nose pressed against the window, watching the green fields roll past. The cemetery was a peaceful place, situated on a low hill overlooking the Rock River. The grass was thick and green, dotted with yellow dandelions, and the branches of the old oaks were heavy with summer leaves. I parked the car and walked up the gravel path, Buddy walking right beside me, his collar tags clicking softly. We stopped in front of a simple granite headstone set in the shadow of a large maple. The stone was gray, polished on the front with the inscription, Clifford Vance, 1955-2026. A true friend. The work stands. I stood looking at the stone for a long time. The warm wind was blowing from the river, carrying the smell of clover and damp earth. Buddy walked over, gave the granite base a gentle sniff, and then sat down by my boots, his white-muzzled face calm and patient. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Clifford's steel watch. I held it in my hand, feeling the solid weight of it. I used my thumb to wind the side stem, listening to the tight, clean clicks of the gears. It was ticking steadily, measuring out the seconds of a quiet afternoon. "The work is closed, Clifford," I said softly, looking at the stone. "We finished the probate this week. Richard Caldwell did a clean job. Philip is keeping the storage yards tidy and Carol is watching the bonds. The business is in good hands." I paused, looking down at Buddy, who had closed his eyes in the warm sun. "I saw Brenda last week, Clifford," I said, my voice quiet in the warm air. "She's working at the dental clinic." She looked tired, but she was smiling when she dropped Toby off. She asked me how my knees were doing. First time she's asked me that without looking at my pocket first. Maybe she'll learn how to build an honest life, too. I hope she does. But Toby is the one who's going to carry our tools forward. He's got Martha's stubbornness and your focus, Clifford. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out one last item. It was the stale bread roll from Clement Street. It had been sitting on my dresser for 8 months, and it was completely dried out now, the crust hard as plaster and gray with dust. I knelt down, my old knees popping in the quiet afternoon, and placed the roll flat on the granite base of the headstone. "I kept it," I told Clifford, "like I said I would, just to remind myself of the night I was locked out and the night your watch started ticking for me. But I don't need it to keep me straight anymore. The line is cut." I stood up, wiping a trace of dust from my fingers. I looked down at the granite base, where the hard, stale bread sat next to Clifford's name. It looked like a piece of old scrap left behind on a clean shop floor. I turned and looked back toward the river, where the sun was starting to dip behind the green hills, painting the water in long strokes of orange and gold. I tucked the ticking watch back under my sleeve. "Let's go home, boy," I told Buddy. Buddy stood up, shook his thick coat, and gave his tail a single happy wag. We walked back down the gravel path together, the sound of the watch ticking against my wrist, matching the steady, peaceful rhythm of our boots.